There will be other things and crises in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s that are going to be pushing the United States towards war. Um, One of them is going to originate with South Carolina. South Carolina, if we step backwards a decade from the cases that I've just described for you in Pennsylvania, in South Carolina is particularly hit badly by the Depression of 1819. And when in subsequent years there is a recovery, Carolina's cotton industry remains economically depressed. Carolinians increasingly blame their economic woes on the tariffs, which protected the manufacturers of the North but raised the price of goods imported by South Carolina residents. So when Congress now raises tariffs even further in 1824, southern states, and particularly South Carolina, are beginning to protest. It's Congress's exercise of power over the tariffs and possibly over the South's property interest in slaves that become linked together as one big problem for Southerners. As William Harper of South Carolina will say, quote, in contending against the tariff, I have always felt that we were combating against the symptom instead of the disease. Tomorrow may witness an attempt to take your slaves. End of quote. In other words, excessive federal congressional power was the problem for Southerners, not necessarily slavery or tariff. Certainly for Southern political philosophers and ideologists. The crisis is going to be sparked by a South Carolina politician, John C. Calhoun, whose portrait you see here before you. Calhoun is a Yale Law School graduate, and he's going to be a monumental politician in the U.S. antebellum period. The antebellum period is the pre-war period. Formerly, it's called the antebellum. This is what John Calhoun looked like in the age of painting prior to photography. This is what John Calhoun looks like once photography is introduced. And it gets even worse. John C. Calhoun is going to step forward and introduce the theory of nullification, or the Calhoun Doctrine. Calhoun Doctrine is going to be essential to the South's secessionist ideology. It is going to be the principle on which the South will secede. It has a lot to do with the way in 1867 Canada will confederate. In the Confederation debates, you will hear the mention of the Calhoun Doctrine, and certainly we in Canada, when we're forming Canada, are going to attempt to structure the Canadian Constitution in a way that there is no room for something like the Calhoun Doctrine to unfold in Canada the way it unfolded in the United States. You got to remember that Canada, of course, is debating Confederation in the 1860s as this war is raging just south of our border. And so as we're thinking of coming together into a new sovereign nation, we have our eye on the war in the South and in the in the United States, and we want to avoid a repeat of what happened to the Americans. And so the Calhoun Doctrine is going to be essential to that. John C. Calhoun is going to argue that the United States is a contractual compact between sovereign states. The federal government in Washington was created as, quote, a common agent, end of quote, of the sovereign states, with the duty of, quote, strengthening and upholding the domestic institutions of the member states, end of quote. In other words, that the federal government in Washington is kind of a servant of the states, a servant that serves them jointly. Calhoun will argue that the people of any state acting in a special convention can come together and have the right to nullify any federal law that exceeded the powers granted to Congress under the U.S. Constitution. That federal law, according to Calhoun, would then become null and void in that state. Congress in Washington can then either repeal the law or propose a constitutional amendment expressly giving it the power in question here. And of course, a constitutional amendment means that 2/3 of the states would have to vote to approve that amendment. The states, if such an amendment is proposed, the states could then either ratify the amendment or, and here comes the dangerous part, or exercise their ultimate right as a sovereign state and secede from the Union. Now, that's, of course, very dangerous talk. We're talking here about a state that's unhappy with a law passed in Washington leaving the Union. That would be, if we go back to the example I used about, say, cannabis laws today. So, cannabis, say it's illegal in California. The federal government insists that it's prohibited. The state of California is of the opinion that the federal law is unconstitutional. That would give the state of California the right to nullify the law, the federal law, in the territory of California. And if the federal government continues to attempt to enforce it, it would give the state of California the right just to leave the United States and form its own country, the Republic of California. That's essentially his argument. And this immediately sparks a huge debate in the United States. Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts replies to the Calhoun Doctrine that the Union is not one of sovereign states. The people are sovereign, not the states. And the people, he says, created the Constitution, not the states. The federal government, Webster argued, did not merely act as an agent of the states, but had sovereign power in areas where it had been delegated responsibility by the people of the United States. And of course, that's what makes a republic a unique political system. Sovereignty in a republic rests with the people. Canada, for example, is not a republic, and here in Canada, sovereignty rests with the crown. That's why there's a picture of a queen on our coinage. That's why there's a crown on the front of your passport. That's why Canada's coat of arms still has a crown. We essentially, sovereignty is still vested in the crown to this day. In the United States, it's a different situation. The problem with Webster's argument, and Blackstone mentions this in his commentaries on the law is certainly under English law, sovereignty is indivisible. You cannot divide sovereignty between, say, the states and a federal government. Sovereignty has to be vested in one or the other. So this idea that the people have sovereignty, but they delegate a little bit of sovereignty to Washington and a little bit of sovereignty to the states doesn't make, certainly under English law in the United States, is very much based on English principles, doesn't make much sense. And of course, the subsequent civil war in the United States is going to confirm, Blackstone's notion that the national sovereignty is indivisible, and certainly Sir John A. Macdonald, all the other fathers of the Confederation will feel the same thing, and as I say, our Constitution vests sovereignty in the crown, and then there is, a delegation of authority, not sovereignty, between the provinces and the federal government. And we do the reverse of the United States. Um, in the United States, uh, federal powers are specifically described. Everything else belongs to the state. In Canada, it's the other way. Provincial powers are specifically described, while anything that's left over becomes automatically federal authority. So that's one of the ways when we were forming Canada, we had our eye on what had just occurred in the United States. So it's very difficult for a province to claim sovereignty, notwithstanding Quebec's particular position. It was not that difficult in the United States, especially at that time. And remember, I had already pointed out this issue, how before the Civil War, the United States were. They were referred in the plural. The United States are going to do something. The United States are. That's the plural. Today, we describe the United States in the singular. The United States is. The United States is a country. But prior to the Civil War, it was in the plural. The United States is exactly what the literal meaning of that word was: a united number of states, the United States. Daniel Webster also argues that when it comes to determining the constitutionality of federal laws, it's not a state convention that is to determine that, or a state legislature, but the Supreme Court is the proper venue under its principle of judicial review, that under the doctrine of judicial review, the Supreme Court has authority to determine the meaning and interpret the meaning of the Constitution. And therefore, any law deemed to be unconstitutional would have to be declared that by the Supreme Court, not by a state that may have some dispute with that law or some problem with it. And so Congress then proceeds to raise tariffs further in 1832, at which point South Carolina now does exactly what Calhoun threatened to do. They call a special convention in November, and they adopt a resolution that declared the federal tariffs as null, void, no law, nor binding upon this state, its officers, or citizens. I repeat again, they declare the federal tariffs as null, void, and no law, nor binding upon this state, its officers, or citizens. And they refuse to pay the tariffs. refused to enforce tariffs in South Carolina. President Andrew Jackson is going to respond immediately now. Jackson, in December of 1832, will now nullify the nullification, stating that the Union was perpetual and that under the Constitution, no state had the right to secede. Now, it's not explicitly stated either way. There's nothing about states leaving the Union, nor is there anything prohibiting states from leaving the Union. And Jackson and his supporters, their argument is that no constitutional union provides for its own destruction, that the notion would be absurd. And to underscore the federal government's intent to enforce this position, Congress now passes the Force Bill. And the Force Bill reaffirms the president's military powers in preserving the Union. Now, Andrew Jackson, of course, is a consummate politician who understood both the carrot and the stick. At the same time as he threatened South Carolina, and Andrew Jackson basically said, I'll send in the Marines if I have to. However, as Andrew Jackson threatens South Carolina, at the same time he pressures Congress to reduce the 1832 tariffs. And so when 1833 comes, both sides back off. But now the precedent is set. The Calhoun Doctrine proves to be at the time still a little bit too radical for the other southern states, but it sets a principle that's not going to be forgotten. It also now arms the South with a new tactic. Secession and the threat of secession would become the primary weapon in the arsenal of states' rights doctrine. The South begins to learn that sometimes if they threaten to secede, they get their way. And they will make this threat so many times that by 1860, when southern states actually start seceding, by then nobody expects them to actually do it. It's like they cried wolf so many times that they kind of escaped through a barn door left open because no one thought that they would seriously go through with it. It really was astonishing for everybody how fast the South began to secede after Abraham Lincoln's election. But that's still ahead. That's some 30 years ahead. It also divides the American ideological landscape now. As William Harper will declare, he says, quote, "We are divided into slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, and this is the broad and marked distinction that must separate us at last." So that's another effect of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. There's a kind of a rise in Southern discontent with the Union and the state of the Union. There is a rise in secessionist ideology, and Calhoun is going to lay out the principles of secession. There is also a rise in the pitch of radical abolitionism in the North, where abolitionism is calling for absolute abolition of slavery everywhere. Southerners as well are now beginning to become less apologetic about slavery, especially so after the 1831 Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia. Nat Turner was a slave. He led a violent rebellion in Virginia, and as I think pointed out in other lectures, the one thing that a slave society fears the most is an uprising of its slaves, and this is exactly what happens after 1831, after that rebellion, and so in January of 1832, the Virginia legislature, for once, begins to wonder whether slavery is a good idea, whether they should perhaps debate and consider abolishing slavery. Especially, there is a push from the western part of Vir- Virginia. Virginia is, at this point, West Virginia doesn't exist. And so Virginia is a single state, and it has two different geographies. There's two different terrains. There's West Virginia is mountains, it's coal, it's lumber, it's the higher altitude, it's colder, and there are very few slaves in that part of Virginia. Um, the eastern part of Virginia, closer to the Atlantic Ocean, what we might describe as tidewater Virginia, with all these estuaries and rivers, is where all the agricultural activities taking place, where tobacco is primarily grown, some cotton, some rice, other agricultural goods that slavery is used to produce. And so you have these two different kind of ideologies and economic interests in slavery. A lot of people in West Virginia live closer to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, than they do to Richmond, Virginia, its capital. And so many West Virginians really feel disconnected from the need for slavery and the slave economy of Tidewater, Virginia. So when the legislature takes a vote whether to consider a bill abolishing slavery, um, the the bill is, or the consideration, they didn't actually have a bill, they were going to consider it, it's rejected by 78 votes to 53. And if you look at those numbers, 78 to 53, that's not exactly a huge majority either. To the 78 uh, Virginian legislators who absolutely would not consider abolishing slavery, there were 53 who said, let's give it a thought. Nonetheless, once they take that vote, and it's probably the last attempt by white Southerners to take action against slavery inside their state. Once that vote takes place, from that point onward, most felt that the subject was no longer open to debate. It's now done, and now Southerners, as I say, become even less apologetic about slavery, and in fact, abolitionist literature will be banned in the South. It will be considered almost a criminal kind of activity to call for abolitionism. Abolitionist literature is banned from the mails. No organization calling for abolitionism can survive in the South, and that kind of idea that maybe there'll be an impetus for abolition coming from the South now is, falls by the wayside by the beginning of the 1830s. John Calhoun himself is going to proclaim, he says, quote, I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together. The relation now existing in the slave-holding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. And again, I talked about this in our introductory lecture, but Southerners by now are arguing that African slaves live better than free white factory workers in the North. The argument is that masters care for their slaves for life, the slaves being valuable property, while Northern capitalist factory owners essentially are focused on maintaining disposable free labor, labor that they can hire today, fire tomorrow at will. Um, Trade unions, labor unions, of course, are absolutely illegal, and there are no kinds of benefits, nothing for a worker unless they show up to slave in the factory. And if the factory doesn't have work, then the worker essentially, as I say, is fired. And forget about things like workman's compensation, health insurance. I mean, there's nothing of the sort, or working rights, health regulations. None of that exists in the emerging industrialization of the United States, or overseas for that matter. So there are these kinds of small grains of truth in pro-slave propaganda that's issuing from the South. So abolitionists essentially in the South are going to be seen as traitors, and they're going to be hounded out of the slave states. Mobs as well will destroy their presses, and as I say, their literature is abolished there. The issue of slavery as well now begins to increasingly creep into the national political debate, especially in the presidential elections. Essentially, in the South, until 1836, President Andrew Jackson's enormous popularity in the South really prevented the formation of a kind of competitive two-party system down there. The Democratic Party dominated essentially the South. But with the formation of a vocal abolitionist movement, Southerners now become a little bit uneasy when their Democratic Party nominates a Northerner as a presidential candidate, Martin Van Buren. And Southern opposition Whigs, who had recently been formed there in 1833, now seized this opportunity to claim that Van Buren could not be relied upon to defend Southern interests against the forces of Northern abolitionism. And more, it was becoming an issue between North and South rather than slavery or freedom. Van Buren is going to win the election, but Southern Whigs now make very impressive gains in the 1836 election in the South. And it begins to narrow the margin between the two parties. The term Whig you're probably beginning to encounter in your readings, and it's now cropping up in my lectures. This is a period, you got to remember, where the Republican Party does not exist, and so the kind of opposition to the Democratic Party are the Whigs. It's a new emerging force in the American political system. The term Whig is an old term. Again, its origins are back in Britain, in fact, in Scotland. The Whigamores from 1600 Scotland. The Whigs in British Parliament were the Liberals. The Tories were the Conservatives. We still refer in Canada to the Progressive Conservative Party as the Tories, the Tory Party, Tory. Um, I can't remember referring to the Liberals here in Canada as the Whigs, but they were referred to as such again in the 19th century in Britain. Once the 13 colonies rebel, the rebels begin to be categorized as Whigs, while the Tories are the loyal American colonists who remain loyal to the crown. And so the Whigs emerge essentially out of a splinter group from Jefferson's old party, which was called the Democratic Republican Party. And it has no relation to the Democrat or Republican Party today, but back then that's what it was called. At first, they called themselves the National Republicans, but then this splinter group in 1833 takes on the term Whig, which as will dominate the second American party system. The Whigs, if you want to look at kind of what their ideology was, they were essentially a northern party based in New England and New York. Their base was the emerging northern middle classes, market-oriented farmers, native-born skilled workers, and of course, industrial capitalists. The Whigs favored the supremacy of Congress over the executive branch. They advocated for modernization, for industrial economic development policy, which meant the building of railroads, the imposition of high tariffs on imported goods to foster domestic industrial development, the building of bridges, all the infrastructure that industry requires. And again, as I say, centralization, which the Whigs saw was a way to promote industrialization, that you would need regulation of interstate commerce and, as I say, interstate infrastructure like railways, canals, roads, and everything else that is necessary. So the Whigs, once they're come into existence around, as I say, 1830, are going to inaugurate the American second party system, which will endure for 26 years until 1854. Now, don't confuse the American second party system with the two-party system, as we describe it. The party system means something else, and there are about 6 party systems. The first party system was the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans between 1792 and 1828. By the way, the kind of party systems, this is what historians use. It's not written in stone. It's a way of periodizing the history of the United States, and so historians have broken it down into 6 party systems, and when we come to the fifth and sixth party systems, we're not even quite sure. Historians have not agreed exactly when they began and when they ended, or whether we're still in the sixth, or have we entered into the seventh, and so forth. But the first party system is, as I say, 1792 to 1828, Federalist versus Democratic Republic. The second party system, 1828 to 1854, the Democratic Party versus the Whig Party. And some historians argue that the collapse of the second party system, which we'll get to in a couple of lectures from now, is one of the causes of the Civil War, and arguably it could be certainly one of the causes. I don't think there's any one single cause that brought the Civil War. It'll be multiple causes, and certainly the collapse of the second party system will be that. Just for your reference, the third party system will be 1854 to 1896. And that, of course, will bring us the Republican Party versus the Democrats. And then there'll be changes inside one or the other party, which will inaugurate the next party system. And so after 1896, we have what's known as the Progressive Era from about 1896 until 1932. This is a era that is primarily dominated by the Republican Party, except for the period during the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson's Democratic Party is in power. The fifth party system, of course, comes in 1932 with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's described as the New Deal era party system. It's dominated now by the Democratic Party, the fifth system. And historians debate, when does the New Deal Democratic era end? And some argue it's 1965, when Lyndon Baines Johnson passes the Civil Rights Act and his Great Society legislation, where he reinforces Medicare and welfare and LBJ, for as much as people hated him for his foreign policy in the war in Vietnam, was actually a very progressive president domestically. He did way more than JFK ever did. In any regards, some say this era ends in 1965. Others give it another 15 years with the end of Jimmy Carter's Democratic administration in 1980 and the coming of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And some argue that that's when the sixth system begins. And some describe the six-party system as kind of the moral majority system. Others describe it as the Reaganomics Republican era. And we're not quite sure whether it ended or not. All these systems, they're not necessarily mean that only one party governs. Certainly during the fifth party system, the 1950s were primarily dominated by the Republican Party. Nonetheless, it's essentially, the Republicans are gone in the 1960 election, and JFK brings the Democrats back right up until 1968, when Nixon is elected. So it's kind of a era dominated by the Democrats, but not exclusively a Democratic Party era. So the same thing for the sixth era. 1980, Reagan is going to be elected, and you have, of course, the Clintons and Obama period. But from what we see happening today, certainly under Donald Trump's era, it doesn't seem like the Democrats managed to hold on to this era, this sixth system, in the way that we could characterize as a seventh system beginning. So we'll have to see what happens after this election, whether the Democrats return to power and whether the Democrats can consolidate their hold in Congress, and perhaps we'll enter a seventh era. Or if Trump stays in there, we may have yet a seventh era, the crazy time era, crazy town era. So we don't know. It's, as I say, it's not written in stone. It's something historians use to kind of give some sense of periodization for a period. But nonetheless, the presence and the emergence of the Whig Party is a something that will, as I say, characterize the second party system, and eventually will lead, there'll be a collapse of the second party system, mostly over what's about to happen next. The issue is going to be Mexico. And we already saw the problem with the Missouri Compromise. As one state, one territory, Missouri Territory, is allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, but the Missouri Compromise line is drawn through the Louisiana Purchase Territory, what's known as Missouri Territory as well on this map, and any territory emerging asking for status and admission into the United States north of that line has to be, by law, a free territory. And that left very little territory for slave states to essentially expand, because they're now running up against the border of Mexico. Mexico gains independence from Spain in 1821. It takes over the territories that today roughly make up California, Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Utah. Mexico in 1829 will abolish slavery. But there's a problem. Southern states, as I say, are looking to expand. And the problem, see that once they've expanded into Arkansas territory, there's nowhere else to go. And the problem is going to be in a part of Mexico bordering on the United States, a part called Tejas, or as we know it, Texas. Right there. In Texas, they have a problem. That part of Mexico is flooded with illegal white American immigrants, and they're beginning to outnumber the Mexican population in Tejas. In fact, some 30,000 white Protestant Americans. Mexico was primarily Catholic. Some 30,000 white Protestant illegal Americans are going to flood into Texas, and not only, as I say, they're Protestants, and at that time you had to be a Catholic just to be a citizen of Mexico, but as well they're bringing in their slaves. They bring their slaves with them. which outrages a lot of Mexicans. It's ironic how history has kind of reversed itself. At one point, the Mexicans were going to build a big wall to prevent illegal Americans crossing over into Mexico. And so at first, the Mexicans had encouraged this kind of settlement because um, the population was in Tejas was pretty sparse, but by the time 30,000 Americans flood into Tejas, they outnumber, as I say, 10 times. By 10 times the number of Mexicans there. There were maybe 3,000 Mexicans throughout that vast territory. Now there are 30,000 white illegal Americans there, plus their slaves. And so 1830, the Mexican government now passes a law barring any American immigration into Tejas without permission from the Mexican government. And some resentment is beginning to now brew among the American immigrants who are settling in Tejas and making it their own home. The Mexican government, this is becoming embarrassing to them. It's like they can't take care of their own territory, and the matter is going to be made worse when there's a coup d'état in Mexico City, and a Mexican general seizes power. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He proclaims himself a dictator. He dissolves the Mexican Congress, and now Santa Anna needs a cause to bring the people of Mexico behind him. And so the expulsion of illegal immigrants from Tejas becomes the cause that he's going to unite the Mexicans behind him. And so Santa Anna now goes to war. He marches towards Tejas. The Texans there declare independence and begin to fight the Mexican army inside of what still is Mexico. And so eventually the Texans end up garrisoning in an old mission called the Alamo. And there, Santa Anna's army is going to overrun the garrison. And in the massacre and the Battle of Alamo, is going to massacre all the defenders. And there die all these kind of frontier figures like James Bowie, Davy Crockett, legendary figures in American folklore. And the Alamo now becomes this holy symbol of American expansionism and heroism. To this day, it's sacred ground. And remember the Alamo is going to become a call in the way remember Pearl Harbor or remember the World Trade Center will become, a call in the subsequent wars that resulted from that. It's a kind of center point of a rebirth of American expansionism. It's where Americans feel often their manifest destiny is defined with blood. It's a movie with Billy Bob Thornton. It's a puppet show. It's a cartoon. It's a central theme, the Battle of Alamo in as they say, American political culture. And they're all martyred. So, whenever you have a case of martyrdom on top of that, it's, just kind of heroic death. And to this day, as I say, it's sacred ground in American culture and American history, the Alamo in San Antonio. A lot of American volunteers, especially from the southern states, now are organized by Sam Houston, who counterattacks the Americans, and they're all shouting, "Remember the Alamo," as they charge. The Americans beat back the Mexican army, and they force Santa Anna to sign a treaty recognizing a new Republic of Texas north of the Rio Grande River. Very quickly, once the Mexican Congress is reestablished and Santa Anna is gone, they repudiate the treaty, but it's too late. Texans have now settled there, and Sam Houston is now elected as the first president of Texas in October 1836. And he adopts a constitution recognizing slavery in Texas, and then immediately applies for admission into the United States. Now, President Jackson is still president at this moment, but election is coming. And so, to everyone's surprise, Jackson does not invite Texas to join the United States because he fears that it might hurt Van Buren's run for the presidency. Jackson wants to avoid all that debate that's now going to occur whether Texas is going to be admitted as a slave state or a free state. And so Jackson, on his last day in office, gives Texas just diplomatic recognition. There's Van Buren. Van Buren, meanwhile, when he takes office, makes no move as far as Texas goes. And Texas now remains an independent country, the so-called Lone Star Republic. This was its flag, and it still is the flag of the state of Texas, but Texas is going to be an independent country for nearly 10 years. And that probably, those 10 years, was just enough time for Texas to develop its own kind of political culture. I mean, Texas, as you know, is very different from every state in the union. There's the Texans kind of are, they're the largest state, the biggest state, continental state. They have their own culture, their own way of doing things, and that probably comes, as I say, out of that 10-year period that they had remained independent. And this is the way things stand until the next election, 1840 election. A Whig candidate for the first time, Henry Harrison, is going to win the presidency, 1840. Now, I don't know how many of you heard of William Henry Harrison. Probably very few, and that includes Americans, because a month after William Henry Harrison is inaugurated, he catches pneumonia and dies. The first time an American president dies in office. The Whigs are going to be cursed that way. They'll always have problems whenever a Whig candidate ends up being elected. So this is the first time you have a president dying in office, and the first time in American history a vice president has to take power. And in this case is John Tyler of Virginia, a very unpopular politician. First of all, Tyler actually is a Southerner from Virginia, and Tyler is a former Democrat who crossed over to the Whig Party over the issues of states' rights. But Tyler feels no loyalty to either party. And once Tyler, as president, begins vetoing Whig bills in Congress, um, the Whig Party now expels Tyler, and he becomes a president with no party whatsoever. In the meantime, Tyler begins tinkering with the idea of annexing Mexico or annexing Texas. Or as the Americans will say, because what the Americans are going to claim is that Texas was always part of the United States. They'll talk about re-annexing Texas. Tyler's agents spread rumors intended to bring Southerners behind the annexation plan. The rumors are that Britain was ready to offer economic aid if Texas abolished slavery. In 1844, April, Tyler sends to the Senate for ratification a treaty that would bring Texas into the Union. And that, of course, would mean risking war with Mexico, because Mexico, of course, is refusing to recognize Texas. And as much as Mexico wants to avoid war with the United States, they are not enforcing their claim on Texas. They're as long as the United States doesn't insist that Texas is part of the United States, Mexico will take its time to see how they can again somehow renegotiate or re-engineer a return of Tejas back under Mexican jurisdiction. The Whigs, in the meantime, are preparing now for the 1844 presidential election. They hate Tyler, and so they're going to nominate a Kentucky congressman in 1844, Henry Clay. He is one of the founders of this new Whig Party. The Democrats are planning to nominate Van Buren again. But here's the problem. Both candidates for nomination, Van Buren and Clay, are opposed to the admission of Texas. Again, on the grounds that it's going to threaten the Union, it's going to raise all sorts of debates about slavery, and of course, it risks the U.S. getting dragged into a war with Mexico. And a lot of Southerners are very disappointed about this, especially those in the Democratic Party that had, as I say, had just nominated Van Buren. And this splits the Democratic Party between Northerners who support Van Buren and Southerners and pro-slavery Northerners. You got to realize this as well, that Northern industry also is dependent on slave-produced goods. There are textile mills in the U.S. as well. They need the same cotton that is being sent to Britain. And there's a lot of Northerners who own property in the South, own tobacco fields, own cotton fields, even though they have other businesses up in the North. And it's not all local owners. And of course, these Northerners tend to support the Democratic Party and tend to be pro-slave as well. And so they're the ones who are now calling for the annexation of Texas and its readmission into the United States in order that they could expand their slave industries. And this they're willing to do, even if it means having a war with Mexico. And so this faction in the Democratic Party begins to be known as the War Democrats. And it's a term that will remain through right into the Civil War. The War Democrats will be essentially pro-South, pro-slave industry Democrats, both Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And the War Democrats in 1844 come to dominate the Democratic Party to such a point that they end up, through a kind of technicality, sabotaging the nomination of Van Buren and instead nominate their own candidate, James K. Polk of Tennessee, a Texas annexationist. And so 1844 election, the Democratic Party now calls for the reannexation of Texas, in quotes, that they claim had always been part of the Louisiana Purchase. And as well, it's not just South that they're looking for. They're also talking about the reoccupation of Oregon on the Pacific coast, a territory that is being disputed at this time, that includes what is today the province of British Columbia. The War Democrats want the United States to expand up the Pacific coast all the way to Russia. And of course, Russia at this point is where Alaska is today. Remember, the Russians are in North America. That territory that is the state of Alaska was Russian until the Russians sold it to the United States in 1867, long after the Civil War. And so Van Buren supporters, as Tyler is attempting to bring Texas into, through Congress, into the Union, sabotage Tyler's Texas bill. And now slowly this is the beginning of the disintegration of the second party system, because Whigs are discovering that some of their Southern Party members are deserting their party because of the Whig opposition to annexation. The Henry Clay, their candidate, will backtrack and announce that he actually will support annexation, but only if it could be done without going into a war with Mexico, and without threatening the Union. This loses him the support of anti-slavery Whigs from the North. And so we're beginning to see that both the Whig and the Democratic Party are beginning to be pulled apart from the inside into different directions, that both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party are beginning to divide it between Southern and Northern factions, between pro-slave and free labor factions, between pro-annexationist and non-annexationist factions. And in the end, James K. Polk, Democrat, is going to win. He's going to squeak in by 38,000 votes out of nearly 3 million that are cast. And so everybody is angry. Everybody is turning against their own political parties. Everybody feels betrayed. Before leaving the presidency, Tyler again asks Congress to annex Texas, and this time the resolution is passed. On March 3rd, 1845, on his last day in office, Tyler now invites Texas to enter the Union as a slave state. Now, there is some problem already. Mexico, of course, refuses to recognize Texas as an independent state. Moreover, Mexico insists that the Texas boundary is as set by the way it was on Mexican administrative maps, the province of Texas, and it kind of lays much further north of the Rio Grande River. And Polk, in the meantime, is looking towards the Pacific, towards expanding the railway towards the Pacific. And so he's already got one eye, as a lot of American expansionists do, on that more northern territory than the one that was officially Texas, for the United States so they could build this railway. Here you can see again the disputed territory. Americans are claiming that's theirs. The Mexicans are claiming only that is Texas, and not that the Mexicans are saying we'll give that up. But when Americans say we want to admit Texas, they include all this. So that's not going to go. The South, on the other hand, is very pro-war, and for obvious reasons. Again, the Missouri Compromise had left them with very little territory to expand into. And so they get their war. April 1846, Mexico and the U.S. now go to war. Northern Whigs accuse Polk of provoking Mexico to get more territory, and many accuse him of seeking to extend slavery. Congress, nonetheless, votes for bills to finance the war, but they criticize the war. They describe it as kind of, Mr. Polk's war. And of course, with their party divided over this issue of the expansion of slavery, the Whigs are opposed to the acquisition of any territory from Mexico. As this war breaks out, in the meantime, things become even more complicated. In California, again, illegal white American settlers around Sacramento launched the Bear Flag Revolt in June 46, proclaiming the independence of the province of California, also part of Mexico. And so by January 1847, California is in the hands of American settlers. This now becomes a major war between the United States and Mexico. It's the largest war that the United States is going to fight since 1812. Most of the senior officers in both the Confederate and the Union Army in the Civil War are going to be officers, junior officers, in the Mexican-American War, like Stonewall Jackson, McClellan, and so forth. Many of them are the graduates of West Point, the class of 46. They graduate and then immediately are sent off to Mexico as lieutenants. Robert E. Lee is a middle-ranking officer in Mexico. Thomas Jackson serves under McClellan. Ulysses S. Grant actually meets, McClellan serves under Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant will meet Robert E. Lee during the Mexican War. Thomas Jackson, of course, serves in this war as an artillery officer. Both Jackson and McClellan are actually graduates of the class of 46. They arrive in Mexico as lieutenants. U.S. doctrine of marine landings, the use of Marines to outflank the enemy is going to be first developed at Mexico. As you know, the U.S., or you might not know, the U.S. Marine Corps hymn. It begins with the line from the halls of Montezuma to the sands of Tripoli. This, of course, the halls of Montezuma is where the Marines fight. In Mexico, the halls of Montezuma, the sands of Tripoli is near the end of the 19th century. U.S. Marines will be in North Africa fighting pirates off the coast of Africa and pirate bases there. So that's the reference to Tripoli. But there are this kind of military doctrine. Again, we're going to see it certainly in the landings at Normandy, the landings again in North Africa in 1942, Operation Torch, the landings at Incheon in Korea during the Korean War, of course, the landings as well during the Gulf War in 90. This is a war where essentially the Americans get a taste of big time warfare. Lots of armies, lots of troops, major strategic maneuvers. These are not small, low intensity conflicts like fighting, for example, indigenous natives or rebels or pirates. This is America's first major war, as I say, since the War of 1812. And so the entire U.S. officers' corps essentially is being baptized here. And of course, they're all fighting on the same side. Like McClellan and Thomas Jackson, who were both classmates, fought together in Mexico. And yet, of course, McClellan ends up in the Union Army while Jackson ends up in the Confederate Army. The same with Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee ends up, in fact, the commander-in-chief of the Confederate Army, leading the Confederate Army against the country on whose side he had fought, the United States, in the Mexican War. So a lot of officers bond for life, in this conflict, and these bonds are going to be torn apart in the Civil War as it occurs in all civil wars. The war costs about $97 million. 13,780 Americans are killed in this war, primarily because of disease. Mexican casualties are unclear. It's estimated about 25,000 military casualties, but we're not sure about civilian deaths. We just don't have those numbers. Eventually, the U.S. Army will surround Mexico City. Mexicans will hold out, refuse to surrender, and it's at this point that Thomas Jackson is going to open fire with his artillery onto the city of Mexico, killing and wounding numerous civilians, and that will finally bring the Mexican government to surrender to the United States. It's a victory for the U.S., and American troops parade through Mexico, through Mexico City. September 14th, 1847, the American Army, which is commanded at that point by General Winfield Scott, and General Winfield Scott will still be in command of the U.S. Army when the Civil War breaks out. This war, once it's over, the Mexicans are going to pay a huge price. This will mark the United States' last territorial acquisitions, saving Alaska in 1867 and Hawaii in 1959, Hawaii. But in terms of continental acquisitions, this will be the last American acquisitions. The Americans, in their victory against Mexico, get all this. Part of Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California, Arizona, and Texas now all become incorporated into the United States. The Gadsden Purchase here in brown, the United States start surveying a railway route, but when they get to around where Phoenix, Arizona is today, the surveyors realize suddenly that smack in the middle of the desert in around Phoenix, you've got the Superstition Mountains. That's what they look like. And you're not going to be building a railway through here. And by then it's too late. They've already made peace with Mexico. And so several years later, after the war, they'll make the so-called Gadsden Purchase right there. They'll purchase that bottom of what is New Mexico and Arizona today, where Tucson, Arizona is located, and that's where they'll be able to drive the transcontinental railway through. And that is the Gadsden Purchase right there is, in fact, the last territorial acquisition that the United States will make in this part of the continent, leaving behind, of course, just Alaska, as I said, in 1867, and Hawaii. The Americans will seize control of Hawaii in the end of the 19th century, but they won't incorporate Hawaii as a state until, like I said, until 1959, after the Second World War. So again, the cost, $97 million, 13,780 American lives, at least 25,000 Mexican military casualties. We don't know the civilians. The political cost is going to be much higher. The political cost is going to bring the issue of slavery now into the center of the American political system, and it will remain in the center now as this contentious issue that will now step by step be forcing southern states and northern states into a state where nothing but war will be able to resolve it. Obviously, the question now becomes all these new states that are being proposed out of Mexican territory, are they going to be slave states or free states? And certainly the problem with the Missouri Compromise line is it only applied to the Louisiana Purchase. And as far as the question of whether captured Mexican territory is going to be slave territory or free territory, it could go any way. All bets are off. Missouri Compromise does not apply to this. It's a whole new game, and they're going to be forced to make up the rules as they go, and they're not going to play nice together now, the South and the North. And this again will result in one of the causes of, again, the Civil War. The poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, when the Mexican War broke out, he was very prophetic when he said, quote, um, the United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us. Next lecture, we'll see exactly how Mexico will now poison the United States to the point that they will now go to war with each other in less than 20 years of their conquest of Mexico.